Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Season 1, Episode 1 of The Punisher. Reasonably, one thing that I'm going to say right off the bat, when going to this Punisher show, I think I'm going to leave off the Daredevil Season 2 stuff. Like, I'm only going to really focus on the show as if it's the only thing, and then I will probably have to forcibly tie in some Daredevil season 2 stuff when I have to, because that is a thing that happens in the show. But really, it's not a big thing, so it's just kind of like reasonably you can take this show as its own thing almost. For but they do tie in the Daredevil stuff. So it kind of feels like you have to go see that show and then watch this, but ultimately you can kind of do whatever you want. So this pilot episode, there are some important people that are going to be placed throughout this entire season and that are just kind of like having little slow tussles and bustles about people being inserted into this season. But I'm going to try as much as possible to quickly go through this review, hopefully. So, this episode in a very cryptic like sense. So, right at the gate, when you look at Punisher's skull, like not even looking at it through the Daredevil show, because again, bottling it mostly, I might do some comparisons to this to the Punisher movie to avoid again tying in Daredevil season 2. When looking at Punisher's skull, it looks very robotic. It doesn't look human. When going into the Punisher movie, the skull that is represented on the guy's shirt looks very human-esque. It's just like that Frank Castle is supposedly just a ghost of his former self and this and that. And really, with the movie, you get a bulk of the time a very shut off looking person that never really shows a mixture of anything. A lot of times his look is always that. It's always just Frank Castle in this show is much more of a machine. That's why you get a very robotic-esque looking skull. That's why you get a different look of a skull than you would normally, because ultimately this character is a machine. Reasonably, you can see that through a lot of the stuff that he smashes away through this episode. You can see this guy over and over, just robotically having these nightmare dreams over and over, reliving his past, reliving the things that he lost, and very much every single day mowing over every single horrible thing that has ever happened to him or every single thing he's ever horribly done and this and that. But this guy is a machine, and basically he has anger that never ends. He has to figure out some way to put that anger and do something with it, to the point where I feel that every single thing that he does is a mission. It's not just like, oh yeah, I just want to just do this because the money's easy and like every single thing that he does is a mission to eventually fade away and to do something else that's next that is a mission, because this guy's a machine. Uh, going into this show, I I really like it just because I think at some point when we go through this season, Frank Castle is saving people to save himself. And yes, I will mention it now. Daredevil season 2, like, I don't think he really and truly saves anybody. I don't think it really does save anyone. But I think in this show, he saves people to save himself, because ultimately he is still like thinking that he is dead. He doesn't have like he doesn't have anything, and that he is just moving from place to place to place, and not realizing that he is not connecting to anything. He is not grounded anywhere. Grounded meaning that he's not tied to anything. But slowly but surely, even within this pilot episode, like we are starting to see those tethers more and more come in, and while grounding him and making him realize, like, oh, okay, it's much more so about the mission. It's just like I can I can connect with something. I could uh, feel I can go next to people and and kind of like relate or gravitate to their position and understand, like, okay, like, hey, like maybe maybe life isn't that bad, when starting to see a bunch of people that are on his same island of misfit toys, and now he's like trying to get beyond his haunted memories and haunted dreams, and very much trying to see a light at the end of the tunnel, bizarrely, in a metaphorical sense. So let's go into this episode, because recently, for a lot of spoiler stuff, a lot of these things are just like, hey, new person in town, hey, great, let's see who they are and this and that. There's some of these people that I'm going to quickly mention, but probably won't be more prominent until episodes later. Um, so yeah, there are going to be some people that I think in the first episode are just going to be like randomly, seemingly important. Um, but yeah, so let's go into spoilers, because yeah, very interesting show. Basically gets like within the first portion of this, you get to understand where Frank is if you didn't watch the Daredevil show. It ultimately helps you to figure out that this guy has basically killed everybody, but that won't bring what he lost back. So, spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So, going into the very first portion of this show, we have a guy that has just taken a dump. And so, Punisher goes in to said dump and punches the guy in the nose, breaks his nose. He's all bloodied nosed, and he's ultimately uh, like Frank is torturing him and wanting information out of him. And ultimately, the guy is just like, "What are you coming to me for? You've killed everyone. You've killed everybody. But it won't bring your family back. It won't bring your wife and your kid back. Or your kids back. It won't bring it back." But every single time Frank is robotically going through and killing people, uh, he is repeatedly having this song that keeps coming on, or the song that I think he at some point he had told his kids uh, about. Uh, like one God, what is this song? It's like uh one hump, two hump, three humps full, or something like that. Uh, Very much. It comes on much more. I think it like barely showcases itself in this episode, but it's something like that. Where it's just kind of some song that he like, or something that he would always uh, go and tell his kids. And so ultimately, when he kills people, it's just like, okay, well, I took that one down, but now I'm gonna like, it's kind of like the beer song, take one down, pass it around, but I'm gonna kill more people at the end of the day. It's kind of like, if anything, could just be like numbering a bottle of beer, but when it comes down to it, he's gonna just like, yeah, but I want to take down more, I want to kill more, and that's all that Frank is a machine. So we have Frank kill this guy in the bathroom stall. The other guys that are taking a whiz are thinking that he's doing something other than killing somebody, and so immediately they're like, "Get a room, you schmucks!" So those guys leave. So cue cue Frank being this guy named Pete, and so basically we're supposed to call this guy Pete, so I think that's what I will do until Pete is now no longer Pete at some point in this show. But whenever he's not, whenever he doesn't need to be Pete, I think I'll siphon in that Frank Castle name at some points. So Pete is a construction worker, just sledgehammering away on seemingly any walls, any brick, concrete, cement, whatever ash like walls, just sledgehammering away because this guy loves his sledgehammer. He loves his hammer. It's kind of like Thor. So we ultimately have this guy who is really rubbing people the wrong way because ultimately this guy works nonstop, works off the clock, sledgehammering away at everything. So reasonably, a lot of the guys are mentioning that this guy isn't all that bright, or he is a person that doesn't respond, or he's a person that is some kind of like gimp or something like that, some kind of mentally challenged person where their thoughts aren't all there, or this and that. So, because reasonably, whenever they talk to him, he doesn't respond, and for good reason. For them to not think of anything of this guy. But anyways, so we have it to where Frank, or God, we have it to where Pete is sledgehammering away, and so we have it to where some of the guys are getting their feathers ruffled with this guy. So immediately they come to him and they ultimately tell him, "Hey, you know what? It's great that you're working so hard, but reasonably it seems like you never leave here. It seems like you're working off the clock, and you know what, that's great and all, but a lot of the other guys aren't getting overtime because you are finishing this job too early for a lot of us. So hey, how about you cut it out whatever you're doing?" And so Pete says absolutely nothing because that's like, Pete rarely says anything in this show, with the exception of when he has actual friends that he knows. So cue him saying nothing, and so eventually the guys knock around his lunchbox and then step on his sandwich. And so we have this character named Donnie that very much is trying to make friends, but it seems in the end a lot of these guys are like, he's the new guy. Like, if anything, we've been friends for a very long time. if he ultimately like says, "Hey, how about I come with you guys and have a good time?" It's like, nope, car's full. Ultimately, he has to kind of bribe his way into these people, or bribe his way into these people to ultimately tell him, "Hey, drinks are all on me." So eventually, when these guys step on his sandwich, ultimately Donnie is like, you know what? It seems like I'm not making friends with these guys, and so maybe I'll go and try to make friends with Pete, but then I'll also try to explain to him in a nicer way uh, what these guys were trying to do in a meaner way. Like, I'm gonna try to re-explain to him that, like, hey man, like, I need some money, and here's why. So Donnie goes and uh, approaches Pete, and ultimately is like, man, it's really high up here. Like, why are you up here so high? And Pete says, is like, well, I'm up here so high so no one else would come up here. And he's like, oh, you do talk. And so Donnie is reconfirming. It's like, well, hey, like, hey man, like, whatever floats your boat, but like, recently for me, it's like, hopefully I can get that overtime because my mom is sick, and ultimately I'm just kind of making by. So like, hey man, like, if there's any way that you can kind of float some overtime into my way, like, I would really appreciate it. But like, hey, do what you want to do. And so ultimately Donnie kind of opens up about himself, and basically like tells like excuse me, tells Pete, it's like, hey man, like I have one of these sandwiches in here. Like, ultimately, my mom, she makes the best sandwiches in all five boroughs. So here's a sandwich. And ultimately, like, Pete says, like, well, hey, if I eat this sandwich, would you shut up? And Pete's like, I don't know, we'll see. So Pete grabs one of the sandwiches, and Donnie still talks away. So recently, eventually, Donnie asks uh, Pete, it's like, hey, looks like you have some bullet hole scars. It's like, were you in the military? And ultimately, Frank tells him that he's in the Marines. He's like, oh yeah, Marines, yeah. Like, I know somebody from the Marines, this and that, and trying to relate. So eventually, Frank, the more Donnie tries to pry, the more Pete is just like, you know what? It's great that you gave me the sandwich and that you made your way all over here, but you know what? How about you just kind of like peter off? And Donnie's like, okay, all right, yeah, I get it. So Donnie goes away. So recently, here's where we like transition a little bit. We'll transition to some other characters that are also kind of tied to still uh, Frank. Uh, but yeah, so we have this detective named Dinah, and ultimately, this is a detective that seemed to really be on everyone's crap list. And recently, you have a boss that is treating her like dirt, and basically saying all these outrageous like uh, comments because he knows he can get away with it, and like everything is sounding very like, wow, really, you're gonna go there? But I guess this is like, dude, I'm your superior. What are you gonna do? So this detective treats it as just like, nah, whatever. So eventually, she is tied with some partner that is basically knee deep in crap, anyways. So no one's gonna do him any favors. So ideally Dinah asks him to do some job, and immediately he's like, "Are you seriously gonna have me do this?" Because ultimately, it's like yeah, I'm already in trouble as it is, but you know what? Like, meh, like I don't care. I guess I'll do this for you, because like, how much more bottom of the barrel can I go? So, kind of cementing that these two new partners are going to work out, and eventually we have her eventually talking to her mother, and her talking to her mother, like her mother the entire time while they're talking is stonewalling her, and basically be like her mother is not getting answers from her, but it seems like her mother is like a therapist, or she's trying to very much like talk with her, but it's like theme seems like she's much more like analyzing her. But Dinah is talking to her, and it's like, dude, I'm not getting anything from you. Like it seems that like I'm just talking to a wall, because every answer that I'm getting out of you is either a lie, or it's either just like it's just I can't trust it. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic, but we're gonna move on quickly, to go into Curtis, that I think is a um, much more interesting character, because ultimately Dinah gets, or the detective, the female detective gets interesting, but not quite yet. It's kind of a very generic detective uh, until something happens in the show. So we have Curtis. Curtis is a past Marine, and now he's going in a very much Avengers Endgame Captain America like way, uh, kind of therapeutically talking to some like-minded associates that have been in battles and been in the military and this and that, and ultimately he's trying to therapeutically talk to them and try to work them through their problems, or just kind of hear them out. Curtis's story opens up with a guy that is in a hole, that it seems like he can't get his way out of it, that he's just struggling, and he has nowhere to go. And so immediately some other guy jumps into the hole, and so the first guy is asking the second guy, like, hey, like, why did you jump in here? Like now both of us can't get out. And immediately the second guy goes, hey man, I've been in this hole before, like I know how to dig my way out. That is kind of the opening story that Curtis delivers, to tell people that, like, hey, like somebody has already been there. So like it's kind of the therapeutic, like, hey man, just ask for a helping hand to therapeutically work through your problems by reaching out to someone else. So ultimately he opens up to like say, hey, anybody else want to talk today? We ultimately have one older military guy who's kind of quickly going into mentioning about like certain agendas of certain kind of people, and then we have another guy chime in like, here we go again, like here we go, we have um, some guy talked about certain kind of people that feel like they're getting a better place in life and this and that, and so it's like, well, yeah, because it's true and blah blah blah. And so we ultimately have this character named Lewis that is going to become a very vitally important part of this show, uh, besides one other character. Lewis very much had just come from a tour, and ultimately he is speaking up on how like he feels that the system is kind of against him, and this and that, and the other guy that spoke uh, about certain people getting certain kind of treatments and blah blah blah. He's like, yeah, yeah, son. I'm like, yeah, I kind of can relate to that. Ultimately, he's trying to like talk about um, like everybody's not like helping him. There's a lot of these. There's a lot of times where I can understand a lot of people really finally getting to like when they get really deep into the system and stuff like that, to ultimately a lot of people can think everyone's out to get them, or that what they thought they were going into wasn't really, like, you get a lot of those kinds of people. You get to where you get a lot of people that also think that also like some somebody owes them one, something like that. You always kind of get that. You get a lot of processes and stuff where people um, are just trying to put their lives back together, this and that, and people are trying to work through stuff, and it's just difficult and it's just hard. So we ultimately get to where this therapy session is wrapping up, everybody's leaving, and Frank comes in. I say Frank because Curtis knows Frank, because ultimately they had worked, they had been in Afghanistan together, being in the Marines. So we have it to where Frank mentions to Curtis, "Hey, I read this book." Curtis says, "Good, books help. I've been telling our youngster Lewis that," and yeah. So Frank ultimately mentions about how his, like, how he sees himself as being dead, as like Frank Castle is dead. And ultimately Curtis is reminding him, it's like, well, hey, like, yeah, all the loss you had, all the murder that you did, everything of all of that, that is Frank Castle. Yeah, that is dead. But you are not Frank Castle anymore. You're Pete Castiglione or whatever. And like, that is your new life. That is your fresh start. That is your way to work through these problems. And all you need to do is figure out how to connect with the world, reconnect with the world. And so Frank is understanding this, but then again, like reasonably, like Curtis is trying to lightheartedly say, like, hey, if you need help, I'm here. Like, and ultimately, if you don't come to me, I'm gonna come get you and kick your butt. And I only have one leg, so that's gonna be pretty funny to see. And Frank, like, lightheartedly says, like, yeah, I'd love to see that too, as a joke. But ultimately, Frank asks him about their time in Afghanistan and if it still like haunts him to this day. And it's like, of course it does. Because ultimately, like, at some point, the very interesting thing about this show, I think that this show would probably work if you knew, like, because at some point in this show, they go into flashbacks about things. Like, I think it would be better to see which order to really watch this show. And be like, yeah, I'm gonna go into episode like 6 because here's when we start getting these flashbacks, or whichever episode that is. And it would be good to watch those first and then go back into, okay, now I'm going to start from episode 1 and work my way up. Because there's an entire section in this first season where we get a lot of flashbacks to help you understand not only Frank, but eventually a character that I'm not going to talk about in this episode, because he becomes very important throughout the rest of this series once we finally see his character. So, cue us having those kind of moments like quickly done and cemented. So now let's get into the mission of this episode, and then we'll call it a wrap. So Frank is just sitting around, and ultimately we or before this, the two guys eventually, or the guys all eventually go for a bar, a drink, an alcoholic beverage. Donnie is trying to win his coworkers over by saying, "Hey, yeah, I'll buy the first round," but he eventually pays for every single beer that they all drink. He doesn't realize that, yeah, they're just going to take advantage of him because they get him drunk enough, and then they basically say, "Hey, you're paying, right?" He's like, "I guess." So he pays for the whole thing, and so he pays for the whole thing, and so we have two of the construction guys that are saying, "Yeah," or we have one of the construction guys that is telling one of his other coworkers, "Hey, um, I need another job. Like I need another job." Because yeah, I have people coming after me. I have loan sharks coming after me, snipping out my heels, telling me they're gonna break my legs or break my ankles or whatever. So I need another job. I need another thing like we did before. And so the other guy is just like, well, hey, like I'll call my friend soon. And he's like, not soon, like I need. And he's like, okay, I'll call him tonight. So aftermath of that is Frank is sitting on the site. He's on his lunch break, and so the two guys are off to the side, and the guy says, hey, we have a job. We're ultimately going to this poker game where ultimately these guys have no security, and they have a lot of money riding on these poker games. And ultimately, the other guy goes like, well, hey, like, why is it that there's no security for this high stakes game? And ultimately the other guy goes, well, these guys are like Shylocks. They're really they're kind of like connected. And basically, what these guys are going to do is they are going to steal from the exact same people that this guy owns money from, and they're going to repay him uh, with their own money. So he's going to steal their money to give it back to them, and so ultimately he's just like, yeah, that kind of makes me feel good. So they accept the job. But then ideally, they are kind of looking around, but then they notice that Frank had listened to this whole thing. And so immediately, they are uh, they're telling him, it's like, hey, like, did you listen to that? Did you hear any of that? And Frank is just sitting around, and he's getting up, and immediately they're telling him, it's like, hey man, you better not tell anybody anything, or I'm gonna take that sledgehammer of yours and stick it where the sun don't shine. So it's like, you better be quiet about all this, or I'm gonna hurt you. Frank says nothing, because it's like, dude, you're gonna do nothing. You're gonna do nothing. So we ultimately have a moment where one of the two construction worker guys that was threatening Pete, ultimately one of their co-workers gets hurt, and that's one of the guys that they were going to use for this job. So immediately they ask Donnie to do this job, the guy that Pete was talking to earlier. So we we have this one thing that I'm gonna transition into, and then transition back into the resolve of this whole thing, because we have Frank being haunted by nightmares of him having good moments with his wife, but then ultimately his wife getting out of bed to be shot by some military-esque looking guy. Uh, Kind of letting us know that Frank is constantly being haunted by the death of his family by a mass assailant that we don't know yet, but we will eventually within this season. So we we see flashes of this. We get to see flashes of Frank with his family, his wife, sleeping in bed, having a good time. Um, but reasonably, that all ends in some kind of nightmarish way every single time. And so here is the ending of this episode. So we have the construction guys all going to this poker game, and they are stealing all this money. But the problem is that Donnie is getting all the money. And eventually, while um, while trying to pick up all the money, he drops his wallet, which ideally shows his ID, and to where one of the guys says like, "Hey, I hope everything goes well for you, Donald," knowing full well that he read that ID. And so ideally, the Donald, which is Donnie, basically once he picks up his wallet and then runs out, and basically they told these guys, "You guys are dead. It's like you messed with the wrong people." So they all get back and go right to the construction site. And so recently they're grabbing Donnie and like mentioning how stupid he is, and they're beating him up. Donnie mentions it's like, "Well, hey, I just left, like I just kept my wallet with me, just in case the cops showed up, so that way I'd have my ID, just so it would be cool." So Donnie is getting beaten up, and ultimately one of the guys is yelling like, "Hey," to one of the other goons. He's telling him, "Hey, turn on the mixer." He's like, "Really? Are we doing this?" So we have it to where they are consistently beating up Donnie, to the point to where they're going to point a gun at him, and ultimately Donnie is just like, "Hey man, I will just run away. I will just run off. You'll never see me again." And they're thinking, no, that's not good enough, because eventually you're going to squeal, and like it's going to happen. Eventually you're going to get them to all of us. So it's too late. So they start beating him up. He eventually punches them, and then uh, grabs some like wire bar or some kind of like construction bar thing or whatever, starts swinging at him. And so these guys put away their guns because ultimately they don't want any bullet fragments going anywhere to kind of loot anything. So they are just trying to figure out how to get to this guy, beat him up, and then drag him to the point of where they're going to toss him off into this area that is getting cement poured into it. So reasonably, what happens is that this guy gets tossed into this. Donnie gets tossed into this place that is starting to pour in cement, and so then the cement is being poured, and Pete is telling these guys to turn it off. And so they're like, oh crap, he's here. So they eventually start fighting him. 3 guys end up trying to fight Pete. And yeah, Pete's not having it. Takes a sledgehammer, just freaking sledgehammers the crap out of all these guys. Sledgehammer one guy in the back, sledgehammers one guy in the face, like picks one guy up with the sledgehammer to smack him again, and it gets to the point where Frank is just tossing bodies in with Donnie for them to be never be found, and ultimately, like Donnie is freaking out because he's like, "Oh my god, a dead person! Oh my god, like what is going on?" And so we have one of the guys who is like, at first he was like shooting at Frank, and I think he gets shot in the leg because ultimately this guy is desperate. And so this guy eventually tries to run away and gets into his car, but Frank gets back to him and shoots him in his car, and then comes back for the one goon. To where this guy is just like, oh man, hey, like, you don't have to kill me, like, hey man, like, we'll just let this all go and it'll all be fine. And so basically at this point, Frank's sledgehammer is broken in half, and Frank is saying like, you know what, like I need a place to put this. And the guy's like, no, and so he's like smashing his freaking head and then tossing him in to that hole with Donnie. And then Frank throws a rope down for Donnie to crawl out of this hole. And at the end of the rope has a pack full of money that says leave town. And so before Frank kills the last guy, he ultimately asks him where the deal went down. So that way, no one comes looking for them. So the guy tells him where the deal went down. He goes back to that place, the place where the guys were all playing cards, and instead of them playing cards, they're all planning an attack on trying to find these guys and try to get to them and whatever. But instead, Frank is going to turn all the lights off and kill all of them, shoot them down, kill them, and take them all down in this one room, kill everybody. He's not leaving anybody. He's killing them all because he doesn't want to have one last person questioning anything. Kills everybody. Leaves one henchman guy to quasi turn on a light, walk back in, and Frank kills that guy. So he walks out of there, hoodie in hand, freaking just walks out of there. And so we have some guy in a camera, or with cameras all over the place, looking at this hooded guy, and he's smiling. That is, of course, Microchip. So yeah, that's the review of this episode. Sadly enough, I had to do a very long review for a short episode, but I tried as much as possible to leave as least stuff as possible out. So probably a 50-minute episode and 45-minute review, but that's all it is. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.